Hey guys, today we'll be looking at Leetcode problem number 454. This problem is called foursome, and first we're going to be looking at what the problem statement says, then we're going to be taking a look at how to implement the solution, and then we're going to be taking a look at what the code looks like. So let's jump into the problem statement. So let's take a look at what the problem actually says. So the problem says that you're given four lists, A, B, C, and D, of integer values, and you have to try to compute a tuple. Basically, that is an addition of a value from A, B, and C, and D that is equal to 0. So you have to kind of get a value from each one of those arrays that is equal to 0. They're making this easier on us by making sure that the length of each one of these arrays is going to be the same. The example that they go over here is basically grabbing values from A, B, and C, and D, and I'll walk through that really quickly. So if we have 1, 2 is part of A, and then B is -2, -1, C is -1, 2, and D is 0, 2. So they're saying that the value of A of 0, otherwise known as 1, they're saying the value of B of 0, which is -2, they're saying C of 0, which is -1, and D of 1, which is 2. So this does actually, if you do the addition, these do actually add up to 0, right? So 1 plus -2 plus -1 plus 2. These two cancel out, and then these two cancel out. So what you're left with is 0. So that makes sense. Let's take a look at how we can try to solve this. So the first method that you might think of might actually be like the most brute force solution to this. And that's perfectly fine for like the first idea that comes into your head. It's always good to tell the interviewer that this is what I'm thinking and this is the most not efficient way I can think of solving this problem. So if we were trying to do this with a brute force way, we could possibly say like, hey, what if we have a for loop that goes over A, right? It goes from A dot length -1, and then it goes for B actually let's make this 0 so it's a little bit more clear what I'm doing. This is pseudocode, so basically what this is saying here is that I'm going to loop through every single one of these, and I'm going to basically go through them and add. So let's call this int sum is going to be equal to A of I plus B of J plus C of, let's just call it M, plus D of K. Right? So basically we're just going to be adding all these, and the way that that's going to look is if you look at this list, we're going to be iterating through this, but first pointer is going to be pointing here, pointing here, pointing here, and then we're basically just going to move the pointer to the right for the most bottom for list, which is this is the most bottom for loop, and then when that bottom for loop basically ends, we're going to be moving this to the right, and then this will be equal to 2. And then we'll go back to the bottom for loop through this again, loop through this D array one more time. We're just going to keep doing that until each one of these, or rather this top for loop ends. And in that case, you should be able to find every single one of your sums. But this will cost you a decent amount of time, because this runtime is n to the 4th. The reason why it's n to the 4th, an easier way to remember this is 2 nested for loops is always n squared, and then you have 2 of these. So just multiply those together and you end up with n to the 4th, right? This is a horrible runtime. But is there a way that we can make this much better? There actually is, and then that's what I'm going to go over right now. So what if we use a hash map here instead? Now this is a pretty good strategy in like most interviews. Always try to see if you can try to come up with a more efficient solution by using a hash map. More times than not, a hash map will come in use because it's such an efficient way of storing your information and whatever data that you need to grab, right? So here what we can do actually is do the first 2 loops, right? We can kind of break up the four loops that we had and just do the first 2 here, right? So then in sum is equal to a of I plus b of j, right? We're just going to add up the first 2 values. We're going to iterate through the first 2 arrays, grab the values, and then add them together. And then after we're done adding them together, we're basically going to do a map.put. And our map is basically, so this is our hash map, right? It's going to, the initialization is kind of going to look like integer. And you'll see why there's a second integer here in a second. This is still pseudocode, so we basically put that with a 1, right? And then this would basically end our for loop. Now you'll see that this is not actually going to work because you're going to end up in a situation where you have multiples. What if you have multiples of the same number, right? You have so a of I is equal to 1, and then b of j is equal to 2. You could also technically have a of I equal to 2 and b of j equal to 1, right? They both add up to 3. So now when you try to put these into the hash map, they're going to go to the same place. You're going to end up putting them in the 3 index and the hash map, right? So what you want to do is basically count how many times you see this sum, which is what this 1 here is actually doing, right? It's what this 1 actually is doing here. But this needs to be edited a little bit to make sure that we take care of the instance where if it's the first time that we're adding R into our hash map versus if there's something already exists, and in that case we need to increment it, right? So we just need to check. So if map.get sum does not equal null, right? If it's not null and there's already a value in there, we just need to increment it to tell it like, hey, we already saw this value. So we're gonna do map.put sum map.get. We're gonna grab the value for sum, and then we're just gonna put +1, right? And then the other case that we run into is that we've never seen this value before. So that one's a pretty simple one. We just put the value there. Cool. So that basically takes care of the instance of us just adding the sum of the first 2 lists, right? So you're still going to have to do 2 for loops here. And so I've already written on the first one, so then we're going to write out the second one. d.length. And this is supposed to be -1, not just the length, because otherwise we'll get an error. -1, right? And so we're going to do the same thing we did with the other one, where we're going to do it in sum is equal to C of K plus D of M, right? And then what we're going to do now is check if map contains that. So map.get sum. If map.sum does not equal null, right? If it does have it in the map, we're just gonna increment count. Now, forgot to initialize count here, but count is just equal to 0. That's just gonna keep count of how many times we basically got to 0. So what this for loop is basically doing is going and checking if this sum of 2 plus the other sum of 2 that we already have in the hash map equals to 0. If it does, we're incrementing the count. And so we can now look at what the runtime of something like this would be, because right here it's n squared. Again, you have 2 for loops, which is always going to be n squared. The rest of the logic doesn't really affect the runtime all that much. And up top, you have n squared again. But these for loops are not nested anymore. You've taken 2 of the for loops out of the other 2 for loops. So now your runtime, instead of being times, which was before, right, which was equal to that, now it's, which in O(n) notation is just n squared. So now we've reduced it, and actually this is the fastest you can get this problem down to, and this implementation is good enough for most interviews. So now let's take a look at what the actual code implemented looks like. So we kind of already saw what the code looks like before, but now we're just gonna finalize it. So in Leetcode, you're obviously given the public class of solution, right? And then the method header that they give you is for sum, and they're giving you int array A, int array B, int array C, and int array, I'm gonna run out of space here, but D, right? So then the first thing I want to do is initialize our hash map that we're going to be storing our values into for the first 2 loops. I'm just going to call it map for the simplicity of it. Right, and so then I'm also going to initialize a count variable here. Sorry, let me just say it's 0. And so now let's begin our first for loop that we're going to loop through. So int I is equal to 0, right? And then I'm going to do this one through A. So a dot length I plus plus, and then the other for loop, which is going to be int j, and then j is less than b dot length, because that's the second array that we're going to be looping through, right? So now we just basically need to add the values up from those 2. So I'm just going to call it sum is equal to a of I plus b of j. And now what we're going to do is check if this value already exists within the map. So sum does not equal null. So if it does not equal null, we're basically going to increment if it's already inside the hash map. So here we're going to do map.get sum plus 1. And then our else statement is basically going to look like map.put sum and then 1. Right, so that's it for the first two for loops. We're going to do the same exact thing down here. And I'm just going to, just for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to use the same variable name here. So c.length. And then I++. And then for, again, using the same variable name as the, this is supposed to be d.length. And then j++. So here we're going to do the same exact thing. We're going to check what the sum is. So int sum is equal to c of I plus d of j. And now what we're going to do is if map.get sum does not equal null, that means the value that we're looking for or the sum that we're looking for exists. We can say that we can add up to 0 with this value. So we just increment the count. That's basically it. You're pretty much returning, at the end of this, you just return count. That's a variable that we use to keep count. And that's basically the entire code right there. Alright, hope you guys enjoy this one, and hopefully you learned something. Thank you.